Hello everybody, welcome to this digital humanism lecture of today, which is a special one. It's outstanding with different respect. First of all, because of the speaker, Anu Bradford. She is with us, but she will be introduced later. It's the topic which is really at the point dealing with digital empires. And it's also because we have a moderator who has joined me here in Vienna, sitting close to me, George Metakidis, who is moderating the session and who will introduce afterwards Anu Bradford. So hello, everybody, and thanks for joining this talk of today. The choreography, as always, we will have now George shortly introducing Anu. Then we have the talk of Anu. She will not use slides today, but she will speak for 25 to 30 minutes. Afterwards, we have Q&A moderated by George. And then at the end, we have a piece of music chosen by Anu with some introductory work. With this, I finish my welcome and hand over to George Metakidis, whom I'm not going to introduce because he is well known to all of you. And I go away from the screen, and now it's George time to introduce him. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Hannes. You actually slide my chair. Hannes slid it the other way, and I slid closer to the screen. Hello, everybody, and we're exceptionally happy today to have Anu Bradford with us. Anu is Henry Moses Professor of Law and International Organizations at Columbia, Director for Columbia's European Legal Studies Center, and Senior Scholar at the Institute of Global Business at the Columbia Business School. I want to remind you that Anu spoke to us last on the 19th of November 2020. Her book entitled The Brussels Effect had come out at the end of the year before. Was not exactly as an accepted term at the time. But since then, a lot of water has flown under the proverbial bridge. The Brussels effect is now an international reference, a global standard. They don't even have to attribute it anymore. They don't have to say, as Professor Bradford said, it's just the Brussels effect, and that's quite remarkable. A lot of other things have changed. At that time, as Anu explained very clearly to us at the time, in the regulation field, Europe played pretty much alone, uncontested, and that gave it a certain advantage because at the end, the one that exports regulation also has some benefits in Europeanizing the global commerce in a certain sense, in spite of the fact that Europe did not have any companies to compete with the US big tech or players or their Chinese counterparts. But things are changing. Things are changing. In the US, for example, the mantra of innovation stifles, regulation stifles innovation, which Anu debunks chirurgically in her new book, is a bit left aside. And instead, there was a statement just a few days ago that the US must play a leading role in AI governance. That's from members of the US administration. As a result, we're sort of deluged now with an avalanche of administrative orders, summit declarations. Most of them are, how shall I put it, romantic appeals to the better nature of the big tech companies to self-regulate. As far as one can see, the European AI Act is still the only thing on the table, shaky at the moment for all kinds of reasons, that has the potential of enforcing power. It's in this volatile environment, that I can tell you what I got out of this book here. I'm promoting it. What I got out of it is it gave me a clear framework so that I could take all the bits and pieces that are bombarding us, place them within the framework, interconnect them, and begin to understand a bit better their interaction and their eventual impact. And I can, with confidence, predict that this book is going to become as much of an international reference as her earlier Brussels Effect book. So with this, dear Anu, please take the floor.
So George, thank you so much for that generous introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I'm really excited to share this conversation with you. So maybe I start with the sort of basic assumption, the premise of the book, which is that I'm observing that we now increasingly have a global consensus that digital economy needs to be regulated. But there is no consensus on what that regulation ought to look like. So in the book, I argue that there are three primary ways to think about digital regulation. There is the American market-driven model, the Chinese state-driven model, and the European, what I call a rights-driven model. So the US market-driven model prioritizes free market, free speech, innovation, and really reserves a limited role for the government, and in practice hands over the governance of technology to the tech companies themselves. So it is a techno-optimist, techno-libertarian view of the digital world. The Chinese, on the other hand, under their state-driven model, they are very focused on making China a technological superpower, and the government is prepared to leverage state resources to meet that goal. But the Chinese government is also leveraging technology as a tool for surveillance and censorship and propaganda in an effort to ensure social stability within the nation and ensure then and entrench the political power of the Chinese Communist Party. So where do the Europeans fit in this state of the digital world? So the Europeans are often portrayed as being forced to choose between the Chinese and the American digital worlds, lacking a thriving technology sector on its own. But in the book, I argue that the Europeans are not able to, nor are they forced to, choose between China and the US. The Chinese model for the Europeans is simply too oppressive. But the American model is for the Europeans too permissive. So the Europeans have articulated their own path forward, which I call this third path, which is focused on a human-centric digital transformation, where the protection of fundamental rights of individuals, the preservation of democratic structures of the society, and a notion of greater fairness as the pillar of the digital economy takes the center stage. So the Europeans, in the name of advancing fairness, are prepared to redistribute power away from the large platforms to smaller companies, to individual users, and to the society at large. So these are the basic three frameworks that I analytically lay out in the book. But maybe it's worth explaining why I call these three leading technology and regulatory powers empires, because empire is a big word, and it is of course many would say a rather sort of provocative word. But I think it is conceptually helpful for us to understand what's going on, because none of the three regulatory models are confined to the respective jurisdiction of any of the empires. Instead, they are all proactively exporting their regulatory models outside their borders, and by doing so, expanding their respective spheres of influence. But what is interesting to me is that they are all exporting something different. So the US empire gets expanded primarily by exporting the private power of US companies. So US tech companies were set free to grow and take over the world. And that is exactly what they have done. They have been enormously successful providing products and services to digital citizens around the world. If I just take one example, Meta's Facebook has 3 billion users in over 160 countries. That is really a manifestation of the global power of the US tech industry. And through the provision of their practices and services, these US tech companies are also exporting the American techno-libertarian free market ideas. So the Chinese influence gets exported primarily through what I call infrastructure power. So Chinese tech companies are building digital infrastructures across the world. They are building 5G networks, undersea cables, data centers, smart cities, safe cities, expanding their surveillance technologies across what is known as the digital Silk Road that reaches across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe. So what is then the export of the European digital empire? And the Europeans are exporting the superpower they have, which is regulation. So the Europeans are often taking the lead in writing the rules for the digital economy. It started most forcefully with the GDPR that followed the data privacy directive, the data protection directive. But then we've seen the Europeans lead when it comes to antitrust, so competition law, with many cases against US tech companies. And we've seen the Europeans also take the lead in regulating content online, now most notably with the new Digital Services Act that was adopted alongside the Digital Markets Act, which provides rules for the gatekeepers. Now already George referenced the EU's AI Act that is at the final stages of being adopted. So by adopting these rules for the single market, the Europeans are actually also exporting them to the rest of the world because global companies often voluntarily extend those European regulations across their global production or their global conduct because they want to avoid the cost of complying with multiple different regulatory regimes. So this is the logic of the Brussels effect and builds on my earlier work. So the European digital empire gets expanded through this Brussels effect and the regulatory power. So here, if we pause for a moment, is the first claim of the book is that the EU is also an empire. This is not just a US-China digital world. The second claim is that we are not seeing a full splinternet, whereby we would see the digital world being decoupled and confined to these different spheres of influence, because each empire is contributing a different layer to the digital governance. So you have many non-aligned countries or third markets where you see the American private power, the Chinese infrastructure, and the European digital regulations coexist at the same time. And because the digital empires are all engaged in different markets at the same time, they occasionally come into collision as well. So what we also see is various battles and conflicts. And the book distinguishes between two sets of battles. So one is this horizontal battle between the empires themselves. And then I also discuss the vertical battle, which is the battle between governments on one hand and tech companies on the other. So if we think about the horizontal battle, the most prominent horizontal battle we are witnessing right now is the US-China tech war. It is a battle for technological supremacy, for economic supremacy, for geopolitical, for ideological, and even military supremacy. So it is a particularly contested rivalry between the two greatest technological superpowers. But we also see another horizontal conflict that is non-trivial. That is the regulatory battle between the American and the European empires. So American companies have come to Europe, and according to Europeans, they take too much and they give too little. They engage in practices that compromise Europeans' right to privacy. They abuse their dominant position in a market that is extremely concentrated, and they refuse to pay their fair share of the digital taxation. So the European regulators are then asserting themselves in an effort to rein in the practices of these companies. And by doing so, there is sometimes a hostile response from the US saying that, no, it's not our companies that are overreaching, it's your regulators that are overreaching. So we see these tensions between the US and the EU. But even while these horizontal battles are taking place, there's a vertical battle that each empire is engaged in their own domestic markets, because they are also trying to make sure that the states are still, the governments are still in charge, and the economies are not entirely run by these digital giants. But these two levels of battles are interlinked, which then introduces elements of restraint to the battle. So when the US right now is considering whether it ought to be regulating artificial intelligence, whether it actually should do more to protect privacy, or whether it should reconsider its commitment to Section 230 and free speech when we find ourselves surrounded by hate speech and disinformation. All those regulatory battles that are the vertical battles take place in the shadow of the horizontal battle with China, which means that the US government remains hesitant to be too vigorous in its vertical battle, because that would weaken the very asset the US has against China in its horizontal battle. The US needs the innovation of its largest tech giants in order to win the AI race, in order to then win the broader technological battle against China. So what we see is that we see rivalry alternate with restraint. We see escalation alternate with de-escalation. So let me now move to the question that probably interests many people in this call, which is what happens in these battles? Who wins? Who prevails in the horizontal battle, and who prevails in the vertical battle? So the book makes a couple of predictions here. So the first prediction is that the American digital empire is declining. The US is losing the ideological battle that was centered on free markets as being the optimal governance framework for the digital economy. So people around the world actually have, in many instances, embraced the US tech giants. They like these services, they like these products. But increasingly, these tech companies are also associated with many of the harms that the digital citizens around the world are experiencing. And even the US itself is starting to lose its faith in pure techno-libertarianism. So if you look at the executive order, over 100 pages, tasking over 25 agencies to regulate AI, that is no longer market-driven model at its purest. That is no longer signifying a faith in techno-libertarianism. There are many, if you look at the various public opinion surveys, Americans want more tech regulation. And if you look at, there being several bills proposed in the Congress by lawmakers from both parties that also call for greater regulation. So even the US is moving away from its commitment to the market-driven model closer to the European rights-driven model. So that is basically good news for the European rights-driven model if people are turning and governments are turning away from the US market-driven model. But let me raise three potential concerns for those who want to see the European rights-driven regulatory model thrive. So first concern is this prevalent notion that questions whether the rights-driven model is consistent with innovation. So we do not see many tech companies emanate from the EU. There's clearly an innovation cap, a technological cap between the US and the EU, and also with China and the EU. But there are many who say that the Europeans are not innovating because they are so busy regulating the digital economy. But in the book, I argue that the problem is not the GDPR. The problem is not now the effort to pursue AI regulation. Even if the Europeans scrapped the GDPR today and decided to abandon the AI regulation, it is not that suddenly, a year from now or 5 years from now, these massive numbers of leading AI companies and other successful tech entrepreneurs would emanate from Europe. So that's an argument which I try to articulate to alleviate the US and the others considering moving towards the rights-driven model from being concerned that moving towards the EU model would inevitably come at the cost of innovation. So if the US were to adopt a federal privacy law, that would not mean that the US would no longer innovate. So to bolster that claim, I offer 4 alternative reasons that to me are much more significant in explaining why the Europeans are behind, and where I would like to see Europeans move closer to the US. So one is that there is no digital single market in Europe. The market is very fragmented, and that makes it hard for tech companies to scale in the EU. So the Europeans should be, alongside regulating the digital economy, be very focused on trying to remove the obstacles from cross-European trade in digital products and services. Second, there is no deep, robust, integrated capital markets in the EU. So the capital markets union remains a somewhat of an unfulfilled goal, which makes it much harder to fund innovations in the EU. So often the EU tech companies need to turn to US venture capital, or are at the later funding rounds are acquired by the large US tech companies. Third is the European approach towards risk-taking, which is partially cultural and partially sustained by legal frameworks. So it is much more likely that an American entrepreneur pursues disruptive innovations, because if they fail, they are not fatally penalized for that. Whereas in Europe, bankruptcy laws are so stringent that if an entrepreneur really tries something truly extraordinary and hard and fails, which inevitably sometimes happens, the Europeans are often not given a second chance. And that means fewer people are trying that hard. And I think that is very much of a problem for European innovation. A fourth issue, and this is personally, I think, extremely significant. Americans have been much more successful than Europeans in harnessing the global talent to contribute to the innovation base of the United States. So if you look at even the leading founders of the household name tech companies, Steve Jobs of Apple is a son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos of Apple is a second-generation Cuban. Elon Musk of Tesla is South African. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, is Russian. Eduardo Saverin, the co-founder of Facebook, is Brazilian. This is not the GDPR story of making the US more likely to thrive in innovation because they don't regulate privacy the same way. It is really these other fundamental building blocks of a thriving tech ecosystem that, to me, explain much more why the US companies are thriving. Okay, so I am less worried about the European regulatory model suffering from overregulation. I'm more worried about the European regulatory model suffering from under-regulation, meaning insufficient implementation and enforcement. So the Europeans are very good at promulgating regulations, but they are less good at actually enforcing those regulations, something that we've seen in the domain of GDPR, something we've seen with the 4 lawsuits resulting in 10 billion in fines against Google, but doing very little to move the market share that the company holds in the EU. So under-enforcement is, I think, much bigger issue in the EU. Then there's a third concern that those who say that the European model is doing great, it's getting great traction abroad, are focusing on democratic countries. The European model holds limited appeal outside liberal democracies. There is a whole host of countries, a large part of the world, where the Chinese state-driven model holds much greater appeal. Many authoritarian countries, authoritarian leading countries, and we sometimes forget it is a big part of the world, like what they see in China. They have very little desire to replicate the European rights-driven model. And let me offer you a couple of reasons why I think that the European models holds a limited appeal in those markets. One is the significance of the Chinese infrastructure power. So many developing countries in particular, they need access to digital development, and China is providing them one. Chinese infrastructure is pretty good and it's affordable. So you cannot hold it against these countries that they are going for it. They, for instance, don't think that privacy is their number one concern. They say they cannot afford to make privacy their number one concern. So they rather expose themselves, if that is what happens. According to the US, it is what happens. According to many in Europe, that is what happens, that they become beholden to Beijing by accepting Chinese infrastructure. Many of them say that, look, I do not worry as much about surveillance or loss of privacy. I worry about providing my country, my citizens, a path to digital development. The second thing, and this is something that I was very uncomfortable writing in the book, but it had to be there because I think it is true. If we look at China, we actually need to concede that China has shown to the world that political freedom is not necessary for innovation. China has managed to create a thriving tech economy without being free. And I think that is something that makes it hard for us, Europeans, Americans, go to the developing countries and say that, look, if you choose to follow the Chinese state-driven model, you will not see innovation. You will not see economic growth. You only get political control. They look at China and say, looks like I can get both. I can get political control and I can get innovation. However, there's a caveat I want to add here is that the Chinese companies in generative AI space are currently lagging behind their US counterparts. And one reason is that the data that is feeding those large language models needs to be consistent with the censorship regime. So there is a difficulty of thriving as a developer of generative AI if you limit the kind of content, the data that can be used to train these models. So it may be that that allows the US and the EU to be vindicated with the view that ultimately more freedom does correlate with greater innovation. Okay, so let me now move to the closing of my remarks and highlight what I consider to be the most important battle of all. And that is the battle over the future of liberal democracy. And through the book, I want to remind the governments and citizens and the tech companies that liberal democracy can erode in one of two primary ways. One is if the US and the EU lose their horizontal battle to China and the world is turning more digital authoritarian. And I have explained a few concerns that I have why it might happen unless you can really have the democratic countries consolidate the democratic front and provide an alternative. But at the same time, and equally importantly, liberal democracy can erode if the US and the EU lose their vertical battle to tech companies. Because if the tech companies ultimately prevail in practice, it means that the European ideological victory is a hollow one, and that the American market-driven model prevails. And that does leave the tech companies in charge. And that is also not a liberal democratic way to govern the digital economy. So here my concern is that the Americans have a great difficulty of passing any meaningful legislation to govern the digital economy. China does not have a difficulty on passing legislations. Second, the Europeans can legislate, but they have a hard time enforcing. China does not have a hard time enforcing. If the Chinese Communist Party decides it's time to crack down on big tech, the Chinese Communist Party is cracking down on the big tech, which leaves me with the concern that unless we can show that liberal democratic governance model exists and can be effective, we are forced to concede that the digital economy is either governed by authoritarians, whereby democratic governments are destined to fail in that same endeavor, or it's governed by the tech companies. Neither is good for the future of liberal democracy, because that would leave us forcing to concede that the true digital empires are the authoritarians or the tech companies. And anybody who believes in liberal democracy as a foundation of a digital society and human engagement should allow that conclusion to happen. So let me end it there, George, and pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anu, for all this dense but still clear insights. And I cannot resist commenting on the last one. We should do everything we can to prevent ending up with this dilemma where either we have to move to China or have our children left at the mercy of big tech, which at the moment are truly becoming empires in every sense of the word, consolidating immense amount of economic and political power. So with this, let us start the questions. Please put your yellow icon up. I cannot, otherwise, I will not be able to see your hands. The first one I see is Edward Lee. Edward.
Hi, Anu. Edward Lee from Berkeley. One of the challenges that I think has actually been slowing down the AI Act has been defining exactly what to regulate. And I think that this is actually become particularly challenging with the ChatGPT revolution, where, how do you construct a legal definition that is, that captures the regulating what is the real threat versus, regulating things that are not deemed a threat or are already, kind of established in their way of working. It seems like it's an incredibly difficult problem.
Okay, Anu, while everybody.
Yes,
there.
Edward, thank you. I absolutely agree with you. So digital economy, in particular AI, which is fast developing and fast moving target, it is really difficult to regulate. The question is then, should that mean that the legislators just take the backseat and become spectators and just observe this process? And I think the stakes are too high for that strategy either. So I think we need to move to the uncomfortable space of potentially imperfectly regulating, as opposed to just giving complete free reins to the tech companies. I think what the events that we witnessed this past weekend show very clearly how big the profit-seeking motivation is. And it is very difficult to then hold on to some non-profit ideas that they were behind the establishment of OpenAI when the investors and the founders are pursuing these astronomical rewards. That's just how the logic of markets and innovation in this space work. So ultimately, I think there's this question of, there are some who say, well, let's just wait, and we at least need to see how generative AI develops in the course of next year. We have better idea. I don't believe this is done next year. We would then next year need to concede, well, now we're moving these multimodalities and this different phase, so let's just see how that develops. I don't think AI is going to be done and finalized so that the legislators will find an entry point where they can say that now we know how far the technology got, now we can write the perfect rules for it. So then there comes the question, rather, Edward, is how do you then regulate? If I make the case that we still need to regulate. And there, I think you also need to realize that to some extent, the regulation needs to be a little bit more open-ended. It needs to be nimble. It needs to be less prescriptive. It needs to be, the regulators need to be able to rather swiftly revise and sort of complement the regulatory framework, because ultimately, I think none of these regulations that are written today are going to be sufficient to govern AI 3 years from now, 6 years from now, 10 years from now, which obviously then forces us to also accept the trade-off that the less prescriptive the law is, the more law is going to change, there's less predictability in the marketplace. But I think ultimately that's the only space where we can operate to try to still have the guardrails, try to defend the democratic governance, try to make sure that we are sort of guarding our societies and individuals and protecting them from various risks, yet at the same time recognizing or conceding that we do not have all the answers and the regulation need to be to some extent incomplete.
Thank you. Alison.
Professor Bradford, thanks for a great talk, and I'm a big admirer of your work. I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit more on the distinction between regulating open source models versus closed source models and how that might play out in the geopolitical competition you're talking about. Because one could make an argument that open source models could be, if they proliferate, could be turned against authoritarian governments.
Yeah.
How would you respond to an argument like that?
Alison, another terrifically important but absolutely hard question. So I am still trying to figure out what my position is on open source, because I think we can articulate a very powerful case for having a regulation that enables and encourages open source AI development. And I think there are several reasons for that. And I think it would be consistent with the European rights-driven model that calls for fairness, that calls for sort of redistribution of the gains from digital development. So the idea would be that then there are many other players who could be benefiting from the open source development. These are very expensive models to develop and run. They're the highest performing ones. So the idea that if we can really provide them open source so that the other players can use those platforms and then build on those open source models, it could, I think, both alleviate inequalities within nations, but if you look at now globally how concentrated the AI development is, also then provide opportunities from for the global south to benefit from digital transformation. So I see a powerful argument for them. But I also have sort of read and listened to many individuals who are very informed, who I think quite powerfully make the case of the dangers of the open source models and how they can be weaponized, how they can be by bad actors, because we cannot necessarily only provide access to benevolent actors. Because in many ways, this whole idea of the democratizing potential of the AI to alleviate these inequalities can also be its greatest vulnerability. Because there are ways then these models can be turned against not just authoritarians, but democracies. They can really be weaponized in ways that can be unpredictable, especially when you listen to some of the developers who say, we don't exactly know what these models can do. So the idea, I've talked to somebody from DeepMind who say, well, we provide structured access. So what does a structured access mean? That would mean something that allows us to harness the benefits of open source, but at the same time, not give the full ability for bad actors to exploit the model, because all the information is not at their disposal. But then there are others who said, look, there are very skillful technologies who can break those safety features that are part of the structured access, and that doesn't fully alleviate the concern. So at the moment, I regret that all I need to do is to acknowledge the dilemma that I think it's a little bit in the spirit of responding to Edward Lee, is that there is an argument for them, but also an argument against them. The same way that I don't think there's a simple answer to saying, what do we do when we are regulating a moving target?
Thanks. Great answer.
It's more between a rock and a hard place dilemma, this one. Giuseppe.
Well, I think there are other strategies that worked well in the past that Europe adopted. And there are at least two cases. One is the Airbus, and the other one is CERN. So in those two cases, Europe decided to become an active participant. So the Airbus was a way to become part of the aerospace industry, which didn't exist and was created from scratch, or mostly from scratch. And similarly, CERN wanted to be an actor in the field of advanced research in physics. So they created an international research center, which is the leading one in worldwide. The mistake today is just they decided they don't want to go that direction, because it's for the politician, it's much easier to just write the law, right? All those two different strategies required an immense amount of investment in terms of money, people, and resources. They don't want to do that today because they are caught in the liberal, neoliberal, neoconservative idea that you shouldn't invest the money in research. That's the big mistake that we are doing today, and it wasn't done by Europe 30 or 40 years ago.
You got the full.
I did. Yeah, I did. Giuseppe, I'm actually I find it very intriguing to think about CERN and other models, especially for the sort of most powerful AI models, to really kind of frontier technologies where we have genuine safety risk. I like the idea that there would be a greater sort of governmental involvement and sort of how we would structure that highest level or most potentially powerful research. I actually, where I somewhat I would maybe disagree or maybe add another view is that I think we have moved to the post-neoliberal order. I think there's great willingness by the states to step in. And I think there's two different reasons for that. So one is that there is the more kind of a progressive left narrative that this economic growth has come at the expense of inequality and many societal harms. That's why we need to protect privacy. We need to protect the democratic structures of the society. These companies have too much power. One is a national security imperative that say that now we need to look at technology through the lens of geopolitics and national security that also then justifies the state taking a greater role. So we see the US moving very far from its market-driven principles, in many ways playing Beijing's game with export controls, investment restrictions, massive subsidies. And if you listen to some leading politicians in Europe, including the Commissioner Breton, or generally the position that France is taking, often cited by Germany right now, it is really leaning heavily on industrial policy, and Europe is trying to keep up with the subsidy race. So I actually think that ideologically, there's much more preparedness to move beyond the neoliberal paradigm, because in many ways we've already abandoned that, and assume a greater control. But at the same time, then the question would be, Giuseppe, why it hasn't happened, is that things are moving very fast. And the question is that right now, the development is in the hands of private actors. And the question is, how do we actually then would take it away from them and say that we are going to nationalize it and sort of put it under a different governance structure? So I think we rather working now with the idea that we have the states trying to impose guardrails, which falls short of having something like a CERN or state ownership with these issues. But I certainly think that ideologically we would be much more prepared today for that conversation that we have been in the past.
Yeah. How true. And there's also the idea of a distributed CERN in the sense of geographically separate AI competence regional centers, however that may pan out. An old friend from Finland, Marja.
Yeah, hello, it's Marja Pirttivaara here from Finland, from the Finnish Innovation Fund. And so nice to see Anu, you here and listen to your excellent presentation. So I have one question about data spaces, which is quite a European terminology, and especially the European health data space. How can regulatory frameworks keep pace with rapidly evolving health technologies and this sharing of health, the need of sharing of health data and its secondary use? And the reason I ask this is that in Europe we have had this TEHDAS project, a joint action about the European health data space, and now we will have a new TEHDAS, the second TEHDAS Square joint action project. Both of these are coordinated by my organization, Sitra, and for us it is the question of fair data economy. So that was my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marja. I think it's a really important question and very related to AI, because ultimately the main ingredient, the input in building these models is data. And the countries that are going to thrive in the AI revolution, they need to have the data, they need to have the computing power, they need to have the talent, and they need to have the institutions that are able to adapt to these new technologies. But without data, you cannot do this. And here I am going to say something that I'm going to preface, that I am a huge proponent of a fundamental right to data protection. Mm-hmm. And what I say now is not in tension with that, which means that we cannot just focus on protecting the data. We also need to figure out how we can commercialize data in a way that is consistent with our commitment to right to privacy. Mm-hmm. So there are ways to use data through these common data spaces, share data, use anonymized data in ways that can also help us to develop better services for private and public use. And I think that's where we haven't had a full single market of actually having the European data be harnessed in ways that serves the European innovations, economic growth, better public services across the EU. And that's, I think, something that we need to do it. And I would be very confident if the Europeans can really push this, because I don't believe that the Europeans will forget the idea that we need to also do this consistent with the retaining the trust of individuals for their data to be shared, because they still believe it is done, the sharing is done within the confines of the commitment to data protection. But that's why I've been rather encouraged by this sort of the newest wave of legislation that is looking at the common data spaces. Healthcare, Maria, is particularly tricky because it is one of those sensitive industries. When we are sharing financial data, health data, there is again where we don't have the real single market, because there are many different protocols that are national in how we keep and maintain sort of various data around the health services. What are the rules on sharing it? So that's one of those issues where actually that would need to be just done at a couple of levels so that we can sort of make sure that there's a way to reconcile the existing differences and actually utilize the data.
Thank you, Anne. The yellow hand is not mine, it's Hannes.
Since we're sitting here together. Thanks, Anu, for your excellent presentation. I have two questions. One is, you are well describing let's say the strengths of each of these empires, no? Where you have the US with these innovative AI companies, you have Europe with the legislation and the regulation approach, and then you mentioned China with the infrastructure. And I would question the last one, because what's really happening, this technology war between China and the US, that the Chinese lose access to latest development or latest technological development at the chips level and things like that. So maybe they have the infrastructure on a lower level of, let's say, development, but on the latest developments, look at the AI and those different chips, they have not access. No? So this is the first question. The second one is going to this competition of this on the ideological political level between liberal democracy, authoritarian systems, and maybe China on the other extreme, is that not only in this innovative and IT sector, this system works well, it also works well with respect to environmental approaches, where they can easily decide to lower, let's say, carbon emissions and things like that, where we, as in these liberal democracies, we have to fight for agreements, we have to wait very long. Those young ones who are protesting on the street, they are, let's say, criminalized and losing, let's say, confidence into the political system. So let's say one is on this infrastructural part with China, and the second one is this competition of, let's say, political systems where liberal democracies do not so well with respect to some of those areas.
Yeah, so absolutely very well taken remarks there, Hannes. So first that I think there is a lot that China can still do even without having access to the highest performing chips. And that's, it seems to be that to some extent the sanctions are working, the restrictions are indeed limiting technological development. There was very recently, though some months ago, China, the Huawei was able to come with a new phone that reflected that they would actually have either the sanctions are not complete, they are having some legacy chips, or somebody's still getting them the chips, or there's innate technological capabilities that the Chinese are building in order to actually be able to have higher end chips. So I am not willing to sort of fully predict on whether we can have an airtight system of preventing China's access into these technologies. The second, China has, in many ways, these restrictions have created a complete Sputnik moment for China. It is all the more motivated to double down on its investments in its innate technological capabilities. But it is absolutely right that if you look at the various elements of the chip supply chain, there's not a single country that is completely technologically sovereign when it comes to chips. This chips system has been optimized, the building of these supply chains, across so many different countries, where the US controls the design, manufacturing is in Taiwan, but a lot of the equipment, for instance, the highest end equipment are in the Netherlands at the ASML. So it's very hard for any country to replicate all those various components within their national borders. And I fully agree that China is a long way from being able to do that completely. But there's still a lot that China can do to build infrastructure. So for many of these undersea cables, to build the 5G networks, there's no American company competing with 5G networks. There are 2 European companies that are pretty good at competing, which are Nokia and Ericsson, but their market share is much lower because they don't benefit from the kind of state-backed financing that China is able to benefit from, and they don't really need chips for that. Then China is still, even though it doesn't have the necessarily the chips that are required to build some kind of some parts of the AI systems, it's still very much of a lead in facial recognition. So in surveillance technologies, it is still leading and it's able to export those technologies. So yes, China is constrained, but there are still many aspects that make China a leader in many of these infrastructure building projects. And then your question of the competition between political systems. I think we're absolutely right that democracy slows things down. China is always going to be faster because it does not need to adhere to the rule of law and democratic governance the same way. It doesn't need to deal with independent courts that in our systems often slow down many of the government's attempts to do policy. So when the US government, President Trump was trying to ban TikTok in the US, TikTok took Trump administration to court and in important legal battles prevailed, because there are independent courts in the United States. That doesn't happen. Facebook, Google, they cannot take the Chinese Communist Party to the court in China and expect to prevail. So, of course, the Chinese system has certain efficiencies that are associated with its political model. But the same way that we can look at those efficiencies, I think they come at the cost of the loss of individual freedom. And none of us are prepared to go for those efficiencies, because that means you need to be comfortable with the authoritarian governance model. So that's why I also say speed is not the only goal. China will always win that race. But ultimately, I believe we have better quality decisions, regulations, governance models, because they reflect deliberation and allow for dissent and contestation and taking a hard look and challenging what the government is proposing to do. But I think for some countries that are looking at different governance model, they look at how the US and EU are struggling within their democratic models to gain control over these companies. And they see China is not struggling. So it is still something that we need to observe as a fact and make the case why it still matters that you do it within the confines of liberal democracy.
Yes. And if liberal democracies leave a vacuum there in the regulation field, vacuum will be filled by others. One last question, that's all we have time, by MF. I don't know.
Yes, sorry, and thank you for taking my question. Michael Feldl.
Can you please show your face?
Yeah, I'm outside, that's my problem. Wait a second.
No, it's okay. So you exist.
Yeah, it's Michael Feldl from the Austrian platform Industry 4.0. I just wanted to add on what Maria said about this data spaces topic. So I think that the German minister Peter Altmaier framed that as like an Airbus or a CERN for artificial intelligence when they tried to kick that off a couple of years ago. And I see one problem that the whole topic of data spaces is more, there's a lot of engagement there from the manufacturing and industrial communities, but they are not like, it seems to me that in Europe we have so many different communities working on similar topics, like digital humanism is a completely different category than those data spaces, but they have a lot of things in common, but those communities seldomly merge in my point of view. I just wanted to make that remark because I think that would be important, but I don't know how to get there, but maybe you have some ideas.
We always have ideas. But Anu, it's your answer, not mine. Sorry for that.
So I don't think I have a specific response to this idea that we have so many communities and so many opinions, and sometimes they may work cross purposes and prevent us from consolidating the effort. I think I can take that at a higher level, that this is how Europe works. We are 27 member states, and sometimes it is harder because we have 27 member states with different views. The AI Act is now in deadlock because there are now certain member states that are pursuing a different perspective here. Sometimes I think it is the weakness of Europe. So I absolutely believe that what has happened in Hungary and what up until recently has been the case with Poland has compromised the EU's ability to be the leader or promoter of democracy and rule of law, because it cannot seem to even really control that within the confines of its own, the European Union. And sometimes these different positions can actually enhance Europe's ability to pursue more balanced legislation. And also it helps the Brussels effect, because already what is adopted at European level is a compromise, and it reflects different views, which means it's less extreme than any other model, for instance, anything that comes out of the United States, because you already need to make sure that whatever regulation works in 27 different legal cultures and is enforced by different legal institutions, which means that those regulations are also more fit then for other countries with differences in their legal structures and legal cultures as well. So sometimes I think it is not a liability, but that multifaceted process of deliberation actually leads to sort of more informed ability to take into account different perspectives. But I completely concede that sometimes it is just slowing things down and making things messy and not serving the interest of Europeans. But I'm not going to concede that it only would be an impediment. At times, it's also a strength.
I have a short final question. Since I'm a big optimist, do you see a bright future?
So I am, in many ways, the book is not meant to be as a sort of portraying a negative picture of the digital world, but it is stressing the urgency. It is not of urgency of making good decisions. And I rather want to empower individuals, governments, and tech companies with the framework to think about what is at stake and what are the choices that we are making in the coming years. I am not sort of techno-determinist. I don't think the digital future is just given to us and written, and we sort of pass the point of like no return. But I do think that we are making choices that are extremely consequential. And I think we need to be hyper alert of the importance of getting those choices right. And there, I think I do argue for the importance of a democratic foundation for digital governance. And I do hope that I make persuasive case enough that would persuade enough decision makers to protect that asset as a foundation of our digital economy. And if that is right, that generally that conversation takes an upper hand in the conversation, then I have all the reasons to be optimist. But I don't think we can't afford to be complacent even for a moment. I think every conversation we need to realize what is at stake and how important it is to get this digital transformation right.
And let's call this tempered techno-optimism, which is at the heart of digital humanism. And with this, let me, together with thanking Anu for this full of insights talk, let me just ask her to say a few words about, traditionally there's a piece of music that follows the end of this event. She chose the music, and I would like to ask her to tell us why she chose it.
Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity. There are many, I think, pieces that I would have wanted for us to sort of share together today, but I wanted us to play and listen to the song by an American singer. This was released in, I think, 1971, Marvin Gaye, African-American singer who sang this really powerful song, What's Going On? It was written against the backdrop of social upheaval, social injustice, police brutality, and the atrocities surrounding the Vietnam War. And I really regret that we also today need to really ask a deep question, what is going on in today's world, given just the sort of it seems that collectively we are losing our sense of sort of leading with commitment to humanity and justice. And I guess it was a fitting to the era that we are living through. So hopefully you will enjoy it.
Thank you.
Great choice. Thanks so much, Anu. Let me just announce the next talk and then we'll play it immediately. So on December 12th, we'll have a panel on AI, again, in a geopolitical context. and it's going to be titled AI: Competition or Cooperation between the US and China. And what about Europe and other parts of the world? It's a long title. That's actually the panel whole title. But panelists are Mei-Lin Fang, Gian Claudio Malghieri, and Joseph Safakis, and Erich Brehm will moderate. And thanks to you, Anu, and thanks to George for moderating, and everybody for joining. And finally, Marvin Gaye, what's going on? See you next time. Thanks very much.
Mother, there's too many of you crying. Brother, brother, there's far too many of you dying. You know we've got to find a way to bring some love in here today. Yeah. Father, we don't need to escalate. You see, war is not the answer, for only love can conquer hate. You know we've got to find a way to bring some love in here today. Oh, picket lines, picket signs, don't punish me with brutality. Talk to me so you can see what's going on. What's going on? Yeah, what's going on? Oh, what's going on? Right on. Right on. Right on. Mother, everybody thinks we're at home. Oh, but who are they to judge us? Simply cause our hair is long. Oh, you know we've got to find a way. Bring some understanding here today. Picket lines and picket signs, don't punish me with brutality. Come on, talk to me so you can see what's going on. Yeah, what's going on? Tell me what's going on. I'll tell you what's going on. Ooh. Right on, right on. Right on.
Thanks to all of you. Goodbye. Thanks for the excellent talk. See you.
Thank you, everyone.